Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Teymoor Nabili. Well, this week in Doha, members of Syria's opposition will gather to discuss one of the most significant changes in strategy since the conflict began almost 2 years ago. The US State Department has decided that the Syrian National Council is no longer able to represent the opponents of President Assad, and it wants a new council to lead the opposition. These meetings come as the UN accused Syrian rebels of possible war crimes after a video emerged showing opposition fighters are executing some government soldiers. Mohammed Val reports.
It's perhaps a decisive moment for the Syrian revolution. Over a year and a half of warfare has seen gains on the ground by the rebels. They have occupied large swathes of the Syrian territory. But these hard-won achievements are under threat. The image of the revolution itself is at stake. Now, some Western powers speak of a possible takeover by what they describe as extremist groups.
We also need an opposition that will be on record strongly resisting the efforts by extremists to hijack the Syrian revolution.
Another major threat, perhaps, is what Washington has recently described as the lack of an inclusive and cohesive political body to represent the revolution and manage its ties with the outside world. The Syrian National Council, or SNC, used to be seen as the closest to that role. But the group is made up of only some of the many movements within the Syrian opposition. So far, the SNC has failed to bring all of those groups under its umbrella. Last April, the US sanctioned the SNC as a legitimate representative of the Syrian revolution. Now it has expressed doubts.
The SNC can no longer be viewed as the visible leader of the opposition.
The remarks on Thursday provoked complaints within the SNC as well as criticism of the US for its role from the outset.
The Obama administration would like to have quiet in Syria, and that means would like any group that will replace the SNC.
In response to those reactions, the US took a small step, signaling probably that the SNC still has a chance. This is not a matter of dictating or an attempt to control the makeup of the next leadership. It was simply seeking to see a broader spectrum of communities in the opposition leadership, including not only the Sunni population, but the Alawis, the Druze, the Christians, the Kurds, any other minority groups, women. On Sunday, the SNC is holding a meeting in Doha to prepare for new elections and perhaps to try to make a final bid for other groups to join. This is not the first time they tried. Last June, the council appointed a Kurd as its chairman instead of a Sunni in order to project an image of inclusiveness. And yet only one of 3 major Kurdish parties is part of the SNC. And the SNC has not only to unite the political opposition, but it also has to win the support of the rebels themselves. It seems the SNC needs to achieve those 2 goals before it can really capture the imagination of both the Syrian people and world opinion. Mohammed Val for Inside Syria.
Well, joining me to discuss this week's events in Doha and the future for Syria's opposition are, in London, Rim Turkmani, a member of one of the opposition groups, one of the non-violent opposition groups. In Washington, D.C., Flynt Leverett is a professor of international affairs at Penn State University. He's also the author of Inheriting Syria, Bashar's Trial by Fire. And here in the studio, I'm joined by Osama Kadi, who's a member of the Syrian National Council and is the president of the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies. Thank you all for being with us today. Osama, let me begin with you, if I might. Now, this week's events in Doha appear to be a little bit opaque in not only the organization, but in terms of the intent. The Syrian National Council will hold its own meetings first in order to discuss its position and its future. And then, at the end of the week, there will be more broad meetings in order to decide on this idea of a new opposition council by the US. Is that right?
Yes.
So let's start with the Syrian opposition, yes. with the SNC first meeting. What are you hoping to achieve in the next few days?
We hope to restructure the Syrian National Council based on democratical mechanisms. So the General Assembly meeting will have like 400 of its members to vote for the General Secretariat, and the General Secretariat will vote for the Executive Director of the SNC, where previously where is not really as democratic as it's supposed to be. So from our previous experience with the executive directors, the members of SNC pushed to have a democratical way of getting our executive directors so they can work more efficiently, and that's what they've been doing by this meeting.
All right. Well, I mean, it sounds as if your agenda is a very procedural and regular sort of meeting, whereas at the side of this event, there stands over your head this accusation, and it's quite a harsh accusation from the United States State Department, that your council has failed in being a proper representative of the opposition, and they want to see a new council formed within which you will only be a bit part player. How do you respond to those comments?
First of all, I need to point out here that this meeting being postponed 2-3 times is not really supposed to be actually even last month or before for this restructuring, because that is the demand of the SNC members itself. It's not really like an order from outside. Secondly, Hillary Clinton's statement has really some legitimate issues, which is on the managerial issues and on the efficiency issues, which is our concern too. And that's why we are here in Qatar with the 400 members to sit with all members, see how we can really upgrade the efficiency of the SNC and work more functionally. Now, the third point is, we a little bit surprised by that statement in a way when she's asking to form nobody. It's usually that's really like a precedent interference in a certain revolution when you ask like that. Like inquiry, because what like the people who forms its own political body is the Syrian revolution itself.
So you're saying she's interfering?
It is big time. It's this interference, matter of fact, was perceived from most of the revolutionary powers on the ground very negative. Which is and the timing actually was not really good for the statement, I guess, because we are already in that restructuring, and we would get more, and we have more 13 even political powers and revolutionary powers joined already SNC, because we increased the membership to 420 members from 300, just to include more people. So I think the timing of the statement perceived negatively, and SNC by itself, it looks and re-evaluating its experience and history and try to evaluate like its functioning and functionality.
All right, let me bring in Flynt Leverett here. Flynt, what do you make of what Osama has just told us? I mean, Hillary Clinton's comments didn't seem to be a request, the way I read them, and nor indeed were the comments being made by some of the other commentators within the United States who were quoted off the record here. Do you think that the way Osama has outlined this is what the State Department is expecting will happen in Doha this week?
I think the State Department is motivated by two concerns. One is that, to put it bluntly, the established policy is failing. It has been 20 months since unrest started in Syria in March of 2011. It's been 15 months since President Obama first declared, with seemingly no sense of follow-through, that President Assad must go. Well, obviously, President Assad is still there, and this opposition, which is supposed to effect his departure, has not become more unified or more effective in the intervening months. In fact, the opposite has happened. It has become more divided, less effective on the ground. And so the established policy is, I don't think it was ever very well thought out, but it is very clearly failing. The United States can live with failing policies for a long time in the Middle East, but I think the second concern that's driving this is, let me call it for shorthand, the Benghazi effect. There's much controversy going on in Washington about timetables, how quickly could have and did the CIA and the American military
let me stop you there if I could for a moment, because we don't want to broaden.
But the critical point here, is that the administration is very concerned that the U.S. ambassador to Libya may have been killed by a group which was armed, supported by the United States or its allies. They know that jihadi groups are playing an increasingly important role on the ground in the Syrian opposition,
we will get onto that.
And they want to try and get control of this.
We will get onto that in a second, but just from this particular perspective, I mean, we have here 400 members of the Syrian National Council gathering in Doha, thinking that they are here to restructure their own body and not really accepting the suggestion that Hillary Clinton can dictate to Syria's opposition exactly how it should be constructed.
And there's no particular reason they should accept dictation from Hillary Clinton. But frankly, I don't think the United States has a coherent policy for dealing with the Syrian opposition. They don't have a coherent Syria policy. And I personally think, in fact, the whole effort to create a unified Syrian opposition is doomed to fail.
All right, well, Rim Turkmani, let's come to you. Do you think the SNC has failed as being the official face of the opposition, and what should be done about it?
Yes, indeed, they failed bitterly. I would like first to comment on Hillary Clinton's remarks. It's very ironic. It's a little bit like North Korea agreeing on the Russian plans to restructure the American opposition. The Syrian opposition is a Syrian matter and should be determined by the Syrians, and no party that is a party to this conflict should play any role in it. We'll accept the interference of any country that is neutral, like Scandinavian states, like the UN, but certainly any country that is an active player in this conflict should not interfere.
On that, you and Osama agree, but you have to
You
have to bear in mind the realpolitik of the situation. And let me quote to you one Washington State Department spokesman, and I quote directly: "We need to be clear, this is what the Americans support, and if you want to work with us, you are going to work with this plan, and you're going to do it now." That's what they're thinking in D.C. So you may have a valid moral point, an ethical point, but that doesn't necessarily detract from the fact that you need the U.S.'s support.
Yes, we do. We need the U.S. support, we need the Russian support, we need everyone's support, but we need their support to reach one solution, but we don't need them to become godfathers of a new puppet regime. I think the equation that the U.S. is trying to reach is impossible. They're trying to find a body that represent the whole opposition. At the same time, they're looking for puppets. They're looking for alternative regime. They're looking for a new government that will never escape the control of the U.S. And that is impossible because so many democratic forces inside Syria or outside, so many parts of the opposition will refuse utterly to become puppets to the Americans, and they have not been even approached to join this new coalition. So that makes it clear what are the American intentions. I would like to comment on Osama Kadi's very, very cynical remarks about not accepting political interference as SNC. This is coming from a body that was formed under Turkish sponsorship very openly, very clearly. The Turks were fully behind the SNC. They give it all kind of support. That was not a secret to anybody. And now they're talking about political interference.
Right.
I mean, please respect our minds.
I will let Osama respond to that in just a minute. First, though, let me just pick up on the point you made. I mean, the State Department obviously is not going to accept the accusation that they're trying to create puppets. What they're claiming to do is to be able to allow some of the voices within Syria itself to have a say in this conversation, because the SNC really is an exile organization. So let me just, for our viewers at this point, outline what some of those other parties may be, because it's been almost 2 years since this uprising began, and the opposition is very deeply divided still. The opposition groups haven't been able to agree on how they might get rid of the president, and a few of them have been trying to form coalitions and gain the international recognition. These are some of the most prominent groups. Let's just lay them down for the viewers. The largest outside of Syria is, as we've said, the Syrian National Council. It includes the exiled Muslim Brotherhood and dissidents, the Revolutionary Youth, and some Kurdish factions. The current president is Abdel Basset Seder, a Kurd who's lived in exile in Sweden for a number of years. The council's primacy, however, has been challenged, principally by the National Coordination Committee, or the NCC. That's an opposition bloc that still functions within Syria. The NCC made up of left-leaning and Kurdish political parties. and is led by Hassan Abdel Azim, who is another long-standing dissident. This group wants the withdrawal of the military and is opposed to any form of foreign intervention. And then there's the Free Syrian Army, which is the main armed opposition group. It consists of some army defectors. Its leader, Colonel Riyad al-Assad, said the group doesn't want any political interference with the SNC and has its own military strategy. And finally, a most recent opposition faction to emerge is called the Syrian Patriotic Group, headed by Haytham al-Maleh. It's made up of a splinter group of former Syrian National Council members. So, Osama, let me come back to you. Some of these voices on the ground that the US wants to see involved in these talks, do you think that they should form part of the government, the new opposition bloc, a new government in exile? And what do you say to Rim's accusations about your group's position thus far?
First of all, is the question for that Flynt just raised: whom to blame? Whom to blame for not really having a real output of the SNC to really push for a international position to support the revolution? Whom to blame that not receiving to the SNC, to support SNC, but $40 million in the entire year since SNC established is the SNC itself? Like, whom do blame to that who did not really support and the Syrian revolution?
If you're looking for someone to blame and looking for scapegoats, is that an admission that you have failed?
No, but that's like, let's say what are the factors that really push you to fail? When Hillary Clinton is trying to state that SNC failed, and we have many concerns about the efficiency of SNC, even being members of SNC. That's why we're here to restructuring to for better efficiency in its working. However, they cannot really just blame the SNC or the Syrian revolution, because they...
Who should they blame?
Yeah, I mean, Friends of Syria. Like, for Friends of Syria, how much money the Syrian revolution received in terms of relief to the Syrian people? They cannot cease fire in Syria. They cannot have a free no-fly zone. They cannot have a safe haven for people. They cannot even have the relief to the people who are dying every day.
All right.
Now, is that something just to blame that Syrian revolution? However, I'll answer Rim while we are here. So if the SNC is a part of Turkish policy and part of Qatari's policies, and being before many of those members in France, so that French policies, and we have many of our members in the United States, then we are American policies. We have to think a little bit more like a legitimate way.
All right,
we're respecting everybody opinion. However, to say that we are just translating the Turkish policies is not really far, because if
Rim, do you accept that?
Yes.
I accept that they're not only translating the Turkish policy, indeed, so many other policies, but none of it is a Syrian policy. I mean, as a Syrian-made policy that puts the Syrian sovereignty and the rights of the Syrians at the top of its agenda. Indeed, we've seen that. They've been guided by misled visions by external powers, one of which is the United States, that the only thing it had to say since the beginning of this of the uprising is that the Assad's days are numbers. Now, I'm at loss as to how high the Americans can count. I would like to point out that there was something that was very clear from the beginning, that any coalition is going to fail at the end of this crisis, because any coalition is weak in nature, and the SNC is a coalition of coalitions, and now they're looking at forming something bigger that is a coalition of the coalition of the coalitions. We are talking about a very, very complex political and violent struggle. It poses major challenges in front of anybody who wants to take part in it. So it's not a surprise that any coalition is going to fall apart indeed if it's tried to put itself as the major, let's say, fighter or pole in this fight.
Flynt, I can see that you want to address that.
Yeah, I think Rim made a very important point, and it elaborates my earlier statement that I don't think you really can create a single Syrian opposition. That if you just look at the groups that are represented in the SNC, if you look at the groups that are not represented in the SNC, if you look at the groups that are likely to be represented in this new body that'll come out of the of the Doha meetings. These groups have fundamentally irreconcilable interests, objectives, visions for Syria. If Assad were magically to disappear, Assad and his government were magically to disappear today, the end result would not be some unified political structure in Syria. It would be many of these groups in the so-called opposition would be fighting one another. And you cannot create a single unified opposition. This whole effort is doomed to fail because of that, and because the Assad government still retains a very significant base of support within Syria, probably about half of the society. And so the only way you're really going to get out of this conflict is through a negotiated settlement based on power sharing between the current government and parts of the opposition.
All right.
But the opposition, egged on by its external supporters, refuses to pursue the only way that you could get out of this conflict.
I'll put that to Osama in a second, but Rim, can I just ask you, given what you said about the complexity, given what we have said about the apparent impossibility of forming any kind of unity amongst the opposition groups, and given what we're increasingly beginning to accept now, that this is a sectarian problem being fueled by jihadists from outside of Syria, do you think that there is a solution at all to be found either here in Doha or anywhere, or is this just going to play out till its bloody endgame?
I think there will be a solution if all the major players agree to this one solution, whatever it is. I think right now Syria is becoming the arena of a proxy war. The Americans are pushing their puppets. The Russians are backing the regime. Many other players are funding here and there. Some Gulf countries are supporting the jihadists, other supporting democratic forces. It's quite messy, but once there is one solution, when the major players, especially external players, agree on one solution, when the US and the Russians sit and have very serious talks and aiming at solving the Syrian conflict, not at winning power within Syria, then I'm sure it's going to be resolved, and I'm sure you will find the Syrians rallying around it. I don't care if a professor in France or a journalist in Qatar, they call themselves the opposition, rally around the solution or not. They really don't matter. What matters are the Syrians inside Syria, and they can't all be labeled as opposition or loyalists. Most of the Syrians, they don't even belong to one particular group,
right.
But they all, most of them, I'm sure they want the best interest of their country, which is now not remaining the regime. They want the departure of the regime, but they want to see it achieved in a way that also keeps their country safe and children alive.
We have rapidly run out of time, so I want to give you...
That's why I think SNC expanded its membership, so I'd like to include people even more from inside, and I disagree with this exile opposition, because Haytham Maleh is an exile opposition, is like he used to be in the executive director.
Can I stop you there, because we don't have time to go into that structure issue. I just want you to address Flynt Leverett's last point, because we only have a minute left. I just want you to address the idea that maybe the SNC should take some responsibility for the problems we have now. The failure and the refusal to negotiate. Do you regret that?
No, absolutely, absolutely. I agree that SNC really should be responsible and state that like has some failure in its like functionality before, and they have to work out harder, more in the future to really get better efficiency and get more opposition groups inside, which they did. I disagree with him that 50% ally with the Syrian. That's a really big accusation of a Syrian that's not patriotic enough to stand next to a regime who was sending dynamite barrels on top of their heads. And in terms of dialogue with the regime, that's really not, this is the major point. We cannot really have a dialogue with the person and regime who kills more than 50,000 people. Say, like, we start the negotiating the transition period after Assad. So Other than this, I think we are responsible for the SNC and the Friends of Syria. I ask them to really get unified.
Unfortunately, there we're going to have to leave it. We've run out of time, but hopefully we'll have another.
You can't ask for a political process with preconditions, much less pre-results.
Okay, we'll leave it there then. Thank you very much indeed. That's Flynt Leverett there joining us from Washington, D.C. In London, Rim Turkmani. And here in Doha, we had Osama Kadi discussing the events inside Syria and the events coming up in Doha this week. Thanks indeed for watching. Our Syrian coverage continues 24 hours a day at our website, al-jazeera.com. You can also find this program there if you'd like to watch it again. But for everyone here, I'm Teymoor Nabili. Thanks for watching. See you next time.